You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
What if you could hear your favorite song for the first time again? Introducing the all-new, reimagined Nissan Kicks. With an available Bose Personal Plus sound system that uses speakers in the headrest to create a 360-degree listening experience. You've never heard anything like this. Reimagine your music and your drive. Experience the all-new, reimagined Nissan Kicks for yourself at nissanusa.com today.
Available feature. Bose is a registered trademark of the Bose Corporation.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 202, The Fall of France, To Make a Corpse Feel. This week, a big thank you goes out to Nicholas for the donation and to Ralph and Marcus for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once every month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. Last episode left off with the French government and military leaders discussing the fate of Paris. Would the city be defended from the advancing German troops, risking its destruction, or would it be declared an open city and handed over without a fight? It was an important decision, but also one that would have to be made quickly because all along the German offensive, the French defenses were beginning to collapse. After failing to stop the Germans along the Somme and the Aisne rivers, by June 10th, in many areas, the French were retreating back to the Seine in the north and the Marne to the east of Paris. But this time, there would be no miracle of the Marne, which had saved France in 1914. With the French once again in retreat, it began to seem that there was nothing that could save France, other than, maybe, peace. All along the front, the French troops would be pushed back from their defensive lines that they had occupied over the preceding days. The overall situation was similar enough in most areas to not require a detailed account, with the French infantry forces trying to retreat fast enough to keep ahead of the Germans, while at the same time the Germans were trying to advance fast enough to get ahead of the French. In some areas, the German mobile forces would succeed. In others, they would be met by what remained of the French motorized and armored divisions that were by this point in the campaign unable to make good most of their losses, but could still act as blocking troops here and there. This meant that when the French armor was committed to try and slow the Germans down, it often resulted in very high casualty rates and the loss of most of their vehicles. The repetition of this pattern rapidly brought the Germans to the Seine and to the Marne, and they were able to quickly seize several bridgeheads over the two rivers during the fighting on June 10th and 11th. Because of this, it would once again be impossible for the French to anchor their defensive lines on the rivers, something they'd been counting on to try and slow the German advance. It's probably worth noting that once again during these advances, when the Germans began to advance and various French units were surrounded, there were actions that were, let's call them, far less than chivalrous, particularly when the Germans were confronted by French colonial troops. Among them were the Senegalese troops of the 4th Colonial Infantry. There would be multiple instances of these African troops being either bayoneted or shot when they tried to surrender. In another instance, 64 Africans would be executed by German troops of Infantry Regiment Grossdeutschland. French officers who tried to prevent this from happening were also killed. When a French officer questioned a German officer of the German 9th Infantry Division why these things were happening, the response was that, quote, "an inferior race does not deserve to do battle with such a civilized race as the Germans," end quote. Hoo boy. While the troops that fell behind were at risk of German atrocities, along the entire front the retreats continued. North of Paris, some of the French units were able to retreat behind the Oise River. But even in this success, they were having challenges because they were kind of beginning to waste away due to the constant trickle of attrition during the retreat. Many of the infantry divisions had lost over a third of their forces by this point, and even more of their equipment like artillery, which was always more difficult to move. On the evening of June 10th, at least along parts of the Oise River, all of the bridges were blown to prevent their use to the Germans, but there were still crossings that could be used north of the city, like the lock barrier at L'Isle Adam, which had to be left intact, even though it would allow the Germans to cross, because destroying it in June would allow the water level to lower too much, sort of behind the lock, which would allow even more areas to cross. These kind of interesting logistical problems were confronting the French everywhere. Interestingly enough, on the German side, they were actually pulling troops away from Paris specifically during this period of time, because of how well things were going. On that area of the front, the goal of the advance was Paris, not necessarily anything beyond it, and so some of the motorized forces that were previously approaching Paris would be pulled out of the line and instead moved to the east, where the German forces had further to go because they were pushing over the Marne River and then they were going to head south. This gave the French the rare advantage of actually being numerically superior to the German forces making the direct approach to the capital, but numbers only counted for so much at this point in the campaign. Morale was a major problem for the French, not necessarily just because French morale was flagging, but because the German morale was so high. They were once again pushing forward very quickly, taking tens of thousands of prisoners along the way. The only thing that really slowed down the troops on the direct path to Paris was the fact that they were outrunning their artillery, and the Luftwaffe was focused on other areas of the front. These challenges caused the German troops of the 18th Army to pause for a day, from June 11th to the 12th, before attacking the next series of French defenses. Before the Germans would pause on their way to Paris, on June 10th, Weygand made an important decision. Over the previous days, the French army had been operating under the assumption that Paris would be defended, and that the troops that were in the city would be fighting within the city itself to prevent it from falling into German hands. However, on the 10th, without consulting the other French leaders, Weygand changed his mind, and decided instead that defensive positions would not be set up within 30 kilometers of Paris, with the goal of convincing the Germans not to target the city with their artillery. Weygand would let Reynaud and the French political leaders know of his plans, but would not inform the commanders of the forces that were still fighting to the north and east of the city, out of fear that such news would cause their lines to immediately collapse. When news that the capital would not be defended reached Reynaud, he had little choice but to begin the process of evacuating the government as quickly as possible, in this case to the city of Tours. At this point, Reynaud was still of the belief that France should continue to resist for as long as possible, with more discussions of alternative plans for perhaps North Africa, but Weygand believed that any of these plans were unrealistic, and refused to give any orders that might make them possible. The French leaders would bring these disagreements into a meeting with the British leaders near Tours on June 11th. This meeting was attended by all the major decision-makers and was the first to include both Reynaud and Churchill since the beginning of June. Weygand would deliver his update to the assembled leaders, that the French army was still fighting but retreating, and that they were near their breaking point. Churchill would encourage the French to continue to resist, advocating for an all-out battle where everyone in France was asked to fight. Of course, from the French point of view, Churchill's suggestion that they should keep fighting sure seemed a lot like the British leader was okay with more Frenchmen dying, while the British refused to make a more full-throated commitment to the continent, and that he was pushing the French to sort of die for the benefit of the British. Now, not everybody thought this way, and at the time that this meeting was occurring, the balance of the French cabinet still favored continuing the fight, but they were up against Weygand and Pétain, who had two immutable facts on their side of the argument. The first was that France could not continue to fight against Germany alone. They would simply lose. And second, that the ability of the British to help and their commitment to help was totally insufficient. After the meeting ended, Reynaud would inform Churchill that Weygand was pushing for an armistice, and that others within the French leadership group were already looking for a way out of the war. As if to acknowledge that this was a real possibility, while he was in France, Churchill would meet with Admiral Darlan to ask him what the plans were for the French fleet. The defeat of France would of course be a major blow to the British, but the challenges that it introduced would be greatly enhanced if the French fleet also fell into German hands. Darlan would make the standard assurances that the Navy would never surrender itself over to German control, but Churchill was already questioning these assurances. The seeds for later actions were already being sown. Even though all the proper things were said by both sides during the meetings on June 11th, this was the point where the Anglo-French alliance entered kind of terminal and irrevocable decline. The British shifted into the mindset that the French were no longer reliable. The French shifted into the mindset that the British were far more interested in sacrificing French blood for their own benefit, rather than rising to the occasion and making British sacrifices in the name of France. Back at the front on June the 12th, the overall situation looked grim for the French army. In the north, the 10th Army was essentially shattered, with much of its strength having been trapped north of the Seine, leaving the entire sector of the front defended only by some random small units, none of which were even divisional in size. In front of Paris, when the German forces there finally resumed their attack, they quickly pushed through the French defenders that had been put in place on the direct path to the capital. Further east, the French forces were saved only by the fact that the German armored forces had been moved elsewhere, which limited the ability of German units to pursue the French. But that just meant that there were more German armored units present even further east, and in that sector of the front, the Germans were crossing the Marne and rapidly moving south. Guderian's panzer group was one of the more concerning German formations because they had found the border between the French 2nd and 4th Army, and they were very rapidly moving south, with the concern being that they would be able to trap French forces against the Argonne Forest and the Maginot Line. There were no real reserves to try and rescue the situation, as everything had already been committed, although there were some frantic efforts to build out some combat units from the men who had been evacuated from Dunkirk, but time was so heavily against these efforts that it was difficult to make anything happen. Even in their poorly organized and equipped state, the first units from this effort, some light cavalry units, were sent to the front on June 11th, although they were not able to really do much good. In the early afternoon of June 12th, the official order went out for all the French forces in the 3 primary army groups to begin a general retreat, including abandoning Paris. The only forces that were not included in this retreat order were those that were manning the Maginot defenses and those that were in southern France. Remarkably, given the overall importance placed on whether or not to defend the capital, General Herring, who actually commanded the army of Paris, was one of the last to find out that his troops would not actually be defending Paris at all. Instead, they would retreat behind the city to the Loire River, which was 150 kilometers to the rear. The units within Paris began to put up posters announcing that the city was going to be declared an open city, and that the Germans would be allowed in without a fight, which intensified the desire of many Parisians to get out of Paris as quickly as possible, which makes perfect sense. More than half the city's population had already left, but the announcement caused many more to take to the roads south and west of Paris, which hindered the movement of French forces along those same routes. French engineers were also sent around the city to dismantle any of the demolition charges that had been placed throughout the city. On the evening of June 12th, Weygand would be far more forceful during a meeting of the Council of Ministers when he said that the battle was lost and that he therefore demanded that the French leaders ask the Germans for an armistice as soon as possible. While Weygand was obviously pushing strongly for that armistice, the rest of the French government simply was not ready to take that step on the evening of June 12th, and instead wanted to discuss the situation again with the British. The result was that a message was sent to Churchill, who had just arrived back in London less than a day before, and he and his entourage again turned around and went back to France, this time flying to Tours to meet with the Supreme Allied War Council. Raynal would actually start the meeting without Weygand or Pétain present, and he would lay out the challenges that the French were facing and stated that his government would soon be forced to seek out an armistice. There was little that Churchill and the British could offer beyond what they had already offered in the meetings over the previous days. Promises, assurances, but little real action. Churchill's primary tactic during the meeting was to talk up the inevitability of American involvement in the war, but there was of course no time frame on that intervention. The rest of the meeting was just sort of talking about things, by which I mean they were discussing various topics, but there were no actions taken. They were just kind of talking, and certainly nothing was done that could turn the situation around in any meaningful way. After such an uninspiring meeting, the other ministers in the French government began to shift further and further into alignment with Végon and Pétain, and their desire for an armistice. A meeting of the French cabinet later that night made this shift clear, with French ministers coming around to the idea that France was simply defeated and that they had no choice but to try and exit the war. On June 14th in the early morning hours, the first German troops began moving into Paris. They were far from a crisp and splendid-looking troop parade, with the infantry units covered in mud and exhausted due to the previous days of fighting and marching. These were the soldiers of the 9th Infantry Division of the German 18th Army, and for the last several days they'd been pushing French troops back towards the city. But the 18th Army had no armored divisions, and so they could only push back as quickly as they could walk, which was one of the primary reasons that they were so tired. As they were marching into the city, the last of the French troops were marching out the other side, with the French police doing their bit to keep the two units apart. Even though the city had been publicly declared an open city, and surrendered to the Germans by a French officer before they even entered the outskirts, there were still concerns on the German side that the Parisians would take matters into their own hands and begin to actively resist the German occupiers. To try and prevent this from happening, loudspeakers were placed on German cars and driven around the city, loudly broadcasting the message, quote, "No demonstration will be tolerated. Order must prevail. Any attack on German soldiers will be punished with death," end quote. At least at the beginning, this messaging would work, if only because of the level of confusion that was happening all over France at this point in time. And at the front, the French forces continued to retreat on the 14th. They were retreating back about as quickly as they could, and there was nothing that was really going to stop them.
Isn't the point of traveling to get away from it all? To feel the best you've ever felt? Then maybe you should check out Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool, white, sandy beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll meet locals brimming with gratitude for an island that redefines what a paradise can be. When your trip comes to an end, you won't need another vacation because you just had the vacation. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at Aruba.com.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first, like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
While the British were never able to provide the level of support that the French believed they deserved or that the British should, that does not mean that in the days after the beginning of Case Red, that they did not provide any support, and instead a growing number of British forces would be sent to France throughout the campaign. After the 51st Highland Division surrendered to the Germans on June 12th, there were still over 100,000 British troops in France, but the majority of these were either not combat troops or were not in contact with the German forces at the time. One of the problems is that there was not really a second British expeditionary force for several weeks after the evacuations at Dunkirk, and it would not be until General Brooke arrived on June 13th that there would be one unified commander of all British forces on the continent. But troops continued to arrive even if they were not kind of grouped or commanded together, with the 52nd Lowland Division beginning to arrive in Cherbourg on June 7th, and the 1st Canadian Division arriving at Brest on June 12th. While the arrival of these forces could be seen as a confirmation of the British desire to continue to assist the French in their defense, there were a few problems. The first was that the divisions of the 2nd BEF were arriving in France in piecemeal fashion, which meant that it would be quite some time before they could be utilized in combat. The second was that these second-wave divisions were far less prepared for war on the continent than those that had made up the original BEF. They had fewer vehicles, fewer heavy weapons, fewer support troops, and most importantly, much less training. When General Brooke arrived to take command of the new BEF, he would immediately travel to meet with Végon, which made perfect sense. He met with the French commander because he was going to work with the French. He would then receive a briefing from Weygand on the morning of June 14th, and from the information that he received, again directly from the French general, the situation looked pretty bleak. Brooke was already concerned that the British army could do little to rescue the situation in France, and of course everything that Weygand said just confirmed this suspicion. Remember, this is after Weygand essentially demanded that the French government start armistice negotiations with the Germans, so it's not like he was in a position to paint a positive picture of the Allied situation. After this briefing, Brooke made a decision. He decided that the only thing that he could do was to try and get his troops out of France as quickly as possible. When he returned to his headquarters at Le Mans, he dismissed the liaison missions between British headquarters and the French military. He then telephoned General Dill and told him that he should stop putting British troops ashore immediately, because the campaign in France was all but over. Brooke then said that his forces had been released from French command by Weygand, and that arrangements needed to be made to evacuate all of the troops that were in France as quickly as possible. Now, Brooke did not have any written authorization that the British troops were released from any obligations to the French, but he had already made up his mind that the BEF had to be on its way out, and so that's what he said. After informing Dill not to send any more troops, Brooke quickly began to issue the orders to get his men out of France. The 52nd Lowland Division was ordered to retreat back to Cherbourg, where they would be evacuated. The Canadian troops were sent back to Brest. Brooke then contacted Lieutenant General Marshal Cornwall, who was the British liaison officer at General Altmeier's headquarters, which had previously commanded the 51st Highland Division before its surrender. Brooke told Marshal Cornwall to gather together any British forces in the area and bring them back to Cherbourg as quickly as possible. As the orders went out, and Dill was informed back in London of Brooke's intention, information got back to Churchill about what was happening, and he demanded that he be allowed to talk to Brooke directly. Brooke would later write that, quote, "He asked me what I was doing with the 52nd Division, and after I had informed him, he told me that that was not what he wanted. I'd been sent to France to make the French feel they were being supported. I replied that it was impossible to make a corpse feel, and that the French army was, to all intents and purposes, dead, and certainly incapable of registering what had been done for it." End quote. As information got around about what the BEF was doing, on June 14th, the remaining Royal Air Force squadrons in France began their evacuation plans. All non-fighter squadrons were sent back to Britain, and the remaining squadrons of Hurricanes moved to airfields around Nantes, so that they could sort of protect British troops that were on their way to evacuation. Weygand would learn of all of this on June 15th, and he was, to put it very nicely, not pleased. In his eyes, the British forces were simply and openly abandoning the French army while they were still fighting. Sure, the French army was in retreat, but at least they'd only started that retreat after making contact with the Germans. The British were retreating before they'd even entered the fight. Also on June 15th, Churchill would try to order Brooke to send the British units back into the fight, but they were already on their sort of evacuation paths, and Brooke was unwilling to change their orders. But by June 15th, in some ways, it was sort of already too late to turn the BEF back around, because in the French cabinet, Reynaud had been the strongest voice for continued resistance, and he had tied his entire argument to the fact that the British were still there, the British were still fighting, and the French had to continue to do the same. Now Weygand and Pétain and others who advocated for an armistice could point to recent events as part of their argument. The British were on their way out. They were abandoning them. The French had to find peace. On June 15th at Cherbourg and at Brest, evacuations would begin in earnest and would continue over the following days. Some of the units were evacuated from Cherbourg, others from Brest, others from other areas, wherever really they could be picked up. The vast majority of those evacuated during this time were British, with over 144,000 British soldiers sort of being loaded on board ships, but there were also 24,000 Polish, 18,000 French, 5,000 Czech, and about 150 Belgian personnel that were also brought out of France at this time. As with the earlier evacuation at Dunkirk, the vast majority of the equipment, heavy weapons, and ammunition that these forces had was abandoned and destroyed before they got on board ships, which was a problem. This probably actually could have been avoided because the evacuations were not under any direct threat while they were happening. The Germans were still far away, but there was urgency due to fears of a French collapse. and so the British were trying to get out of France as quickly as possible. In total, about 192,000 total personnel, basically really refugees because of their lack of equipment, would be evacuated. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of French soldiers, there would be no evacuation. There would be no escape. There was only retreat. But they could only retreat so far. And back in the French cabinet, Reynaud was on his way out, because it was dawning on everybody that the French really were defeated.